Paul McCartney moves into this house, and this is at the height of Beatlemania, kind of erudite, sophisticated, welcoming family. I think he was completely seduced by it. But at this time, he was really discovering swinging London life at its just at its outset.
We start with this very sort of mellow, enchanting, not starting on a major chord at all. Gives it a sense of moodiness.
The Beatles and the girlfriends they had is a very, very, very important part of the story.
Now we've got the love song that your mum would like to listen to if it was on the radio. It's not that crass pop music.
Yeah.
There's a bit of sophistication for the adults in there.
Oh, definitely.
Following the chords. It works, but it's and that's why I personally think it's probably John, because it doesn't have the same voice as the rest of the song.
It's quite earnest and it's quite sentimental, as Paul often is. It's just a really nice love song, I suppose.
But that's fine, because that's it's quite innocent. When you're completely in love, you don't tend to bring in elements of doubt or sarcasm or anything. It's on the nose.
It's February in 1964. Cassius Clay, later to be known as Muhammad Ali, has defeated Sonny Liston to become heavyweight champion of the world in one of the sport's most famous bouts. Southampton has officially been granted city status. Zulu is showing in cinemas featuring Michael Caine in his first major role, and Bob Dylan's The Times They Are A-Changin' is released, capturing the spirit of social change and political upheaval. Meanwhile, the Beatles have officially conquered America and are back in the studio recording their next album. Paul brings forward And I Love Her about his new relationship with the actress Jane Asher. This is UnBeatled, the show where each episode we delve deep into one song recorded by the Fab Four. With the help of an expert, we examine the history, writing, recording and impact of the song, while a resident musician unpicks the lyrics and music. I'm joined by writer and chief rock critic for the Times, Will Hodgkinson, and musician and Fab Four fanatic, David Bennett. So please me and subscribe, like and comment to UnBeatled with Donnie Campbell on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we break down And I Love Her. So Will, And I Love Her is a bit of a departure for the Beatles. It's a ballad, one that they hadn't really done before, although they'd played with the idea with Till There Was You. And it's about this blossoming relationship in Paul's life at that time. I think
it's a significant change. You go back a couple of years and the Beatles were leather-clad rock and rollers on, in the Reeperbahn in Hamburg, living in incredibly squalid conditions and sharing their nights maybe with prostitutes, and there's a lot of speed around, and it was all rock and roll. Now he meets Jane Asher, and it's worth bearing in mind that Jane Asher was famous. I mean, she was a child star, she was an actress, she was on Jukebox Jury all the time, and she was a model. And she came from this very sophisticated upper middle class family in the centre of London. Her father was an eminent doctor. Her mother was a professor at the Guildhall. Her brother Peter went on to be a big record company executive. And Paul McCartney moves into this house, and this is at the height of Beatlemania. So, he's newly famous and still very, very young, and, probably has a lot to cope with. And suddenly here he is with this very, very beautiful woman, and their, kind of erudite, sophisticated, welcoming family. I think he was completely seduced by it. I was imagining, this working class guy, he's in this beautiful house, it's surrounded by books and probably got a harpsichord somewhere, and it's all just wonderful. And it's a refuge as well, because he's, Beatlemania means that he probably can't really walk down the street anymore. And but there she is in Marylebone in this beautiful house. So it's a very tender ballad, it's very sweet. I think it's quite 60s in a way. You can hear it in the films of the time. It's not rock and roll though. That's the really interesting thing. This is a rock and roll band, and this is the first moment which is definitely not rock and roll. It sounds to me like it could be a French chanson or something.
That's a good point. Almost like a Serge Gainsbourg sing.
Kind of, yeah.
Brigitte Bardot's sort of.
Yeah, sophistication, or you can imagine it in Homme et Femme, or maybe a Bond movie in one of the quiet moments. It's very, it's very tender, sophisticated. It's not beer drinking. It's a martini.
Yeah, and the song, as we said, is a ballad. It's different to what the Beatles have been playing and releasing and recordings up until that point. What is it that grabs you musically and sort of makes this song so beautiful?
Well, yeah, it's got quite a few sophisticated moments in it from a musical perspective. There's one very overt moment, which is the key change for the guitar solo. So for most of the song, we're in the key of E or C sharp minor, depending on which way you look at it. And we have the... and then the guitar solo just kicks in a completely different key. It really strikes you. And it's a very typical technique to change key up one semitone, so the smallest amount we could change up, because it has a very stark impact. But typically in Beatles songs, if it's going to have a key change, it will be the verse is in one key and the chorus is in another key. And that makes it sort of more subtle, because here we're hearing the exact same thing we've just heard, but all up one semitone. So there's no hiding the fact that this key change has happened. And that's exactly why they use it, because they want to create that impact. But there's another moment near the end of the song which has got a similar sort of impact to it, which is at the very last chord of the song is not really what you would anticipate. So at the end of the song, we're now in this new key, and at the end we return to that guitar riff that George Harrison introduces. And you would imagine it to go to D minor. But instead we have with D major, which is a technique called a pickety third. It's quite reminiscent of Baroque music like Bach. And I don't know if it was maybe George Martin's idea or the Beatles just thought, what if we end on D major instead of D minor? But just another little moment in there that adds character to the music.
It's interesting. Paul is at this time being surrounded by classical music, probably for the first time in his life, truly absorbing it. And Bond's out in the cinemas. You can imagine those key changes being in a film where the action changes or they turn a corner and the ending is even reminiscent of the final Bond chord, I'd say. Just
true.
That.
It's a very distinctive chord. And of course, this song was written for film. It was written for the Hard Day's Night film. And although the scene in which it's played is literally a scene of them playing it on a stage, what is quite interesting about the song, as you were saying, is that it's not rock and roll. And they couldn't have played it live at the time because it's far too mellow and quiet. But in the setting of the film, they can introduce this song, which shows a different side of them.
So Paul has met Jane Asher. He's now in love, probably for the first time in his life. We can say it's true love. And he's even moved in with her. And then we're starting to see the balladeer of Paul McCartney as he maybe unfairly gets sort of pigeonholed as later on.
The sentimentalist.
The sentimentalist, yeah. And this is the beginning of that.
I think it is. I think it's interesting because this is where you get the two sides of Paul McCartney. You do get the sentimentalist, the classicist. You know, he likes these things which have got nothing to do with rebellion. You know, they're the dirty rock and roll band. And suddenly here he is with this upper middle class family, a beautiful woman who's not rebellious in the slightest. She's very much part of the establishment. And then he's writing this song which it harks backwards. It's got there's the classical element. The Baroque thing is really interesting because I've always felt that it's got that kind of sort of rather tender quality, but also classic songwriting, which he would have grown up with. He did know the sort of romantic standards, so he's pulling on that. But the other thing about McCartney, and I think this is the period when this really came into play, he's always seen as not just the sentimentalist, but maybe the hard-working one, the rather square one. John Lennon was the wild guy. George Harrison was the spiritual seeker, and Ringo was the joker. But at this time, he was really discovering swinging London life at its outset. You know, there's a gallery called the Indica Gallery, which set up, I think, a year later, which he was a patron of. There was a magazine called IT, which came along. There was all the alternative literature coming out, the avant-garde art scenes of Fluxus, and actually he was the first person to meet Yoko. And this was, I think, the very, very beginning of that, because you've got to remember the rest of the Beatles lived in big houses out in Weybridge or whatever. He was the one who was in the centre. And so there he was at the centre of London in this very kind of elite world, let's face it. And so he had access to art, pioneering art, the avant-garde scene, the modern classical scene, all this kind of stuff. So he was, in a way, the coolest Beatle at this time in terms of really, being interested in what was going on. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he had this very much a traditional songwriting sensibility, which is pouring into a very heartfelt words of love. I mean, the lyrics are straightforward, aren't they? Mm-hmm. It's just an expression of love for someone.
Yeah, they're not quite moved on to their more experimental lyric writing yet.
No,
still,
I don't think so.
Keep it down the hit parade, but we're going to change what rock and roll bands can be, but
exactly.
At the same time.
Yeah, and rock and roll bands, I mean, people did have, the Stones would have a slow blues. It wasn't like everyone was doing frantic rock and roll. But this is such a tender kind of Baroque song that you do feel a change there.
Mm-hmm. Mm. But originally they went into the studio and it wasn't a Baroque song. It was drums, 2 guitars, bass. It was one of their rock and roll.
Yeah, if you listen to the anthology, you can hear their first take of this song, where they went for a very different approach, just standard Beatles formula, really, like jangly guitar, drum kit. It feels like a completely different song, really. But amazingly, they went through these changes. They decided, no, we won't have drums. We'll have just the bongos and the clave, which is a really interesting choice. Considering especially that this is going to be on screen, and that means now Ringo is awkwardly sat behind a drum kit yet playing bongos in the film. And what really made this song, which wasn't in the original version, is George Harrison's little guitar lick, just simple 3-note thing, 4-note thing that really gave the song its intro, its identity, because the original version of the song just started with a jangly major chord and then kicked into the... But instead, we start with this very sort of mellow, enchanting, not starting on a major chord at all. Gives it a sense of moodiness.
And just listen to the rhythm there. It's almost got a swing to it.
Yeah, it's got like a bossa nova inspired sound, which, once you've got the claves in hand, they're such an essential Latin music instrument that it's going to sound a little bit bossa nova, a little bit Latin. But it's a classic Beatlism of, it's almost a style, but it's not. So it feels like there's a Latin flavour, but it's certainly not a pastiche of bossa nova.
But they did go full in on it, and George Harrison recorded on Jose Ramirez classical guitar.
Yeah. So I imagine I don't know what the inspiration was, but I imagine the same moment they thought bongos, claves, they probably thought classical guitar, because they thought, let's go in that Latin, almost flamenco direction. And
also, just during their first recording sessions, when they presented the song, they didn't have the middle 8.
Yes. Yeah, and that really completes the song. If you listen to the anthology version, there's no middle 8. The song gets quite boring because it's just the same section over and over. So it was really calling out for this. And that section, it's debated who composed that. Apparently it was composed on demand in the studio because they felt like it needed it, which it certainly did. But some say John Lennon wrote it, some say Paul wrote it. It's a little bit unknown, really.
Mm-hmm. And it's telling that was maybe written at the last minute, because while the rest of the song is Paul saying to a third party, oh, and I love her, she gives me everything, this is suddenly addressing the subject.
Yeah, it's inconsistent with the rest of the lyric, and even musically, it feels a lot more basic. I find it's just sort of following the chords. It works, but it's and that's why I personally think it's probably John, because it doesn't have the same voice as the rest of the song.
John Lennon always liked to be more static on a chord.
Yeah, typically, yeah.
You mentioned the moodiness of the song. It's sad, but also happy. It's minor, it's major. It's got this sort of nebulous.
Yeah, well, the tonality is really interesting, which is really helped by the fact that the song doesn't kick off with what you would call the home chord, the 1 chord E, like the original demo did, which really just painted it into, this is a major happy song. Because instead we start on the F sharp minor chord and later wind up at the C sharp minor chord, we're moving around the key in quite an ambiguous way, which creates this great tonality. It's not as straightforward as some other Beatles songs have been.
Just picking up on what you said, I hadn't thought of this before, but the bossa nova thing, it's really interesting because bossa nova is all about the bittersweet feeling. They call it saudade. And, the big João Gilberto song was Chega de Saudade, which I think came out about 1959, 1960. So it's unquestionably, there was a bossa nova boom, in the early 60s. And I'm sure the Beatles would have picked up on that, and you can hear that in this song. And it's interesting, I didn't know until you said that they are kind of bossa nova chords and that bossa nova feel in the guitar playing. Totally makes sense because that bossa nova is all about that, and bossa nova was also about sophistication. It was the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie. It was discreet and underplayed, and it's not in your face.
And bossa nova wasn't for dancing. It was
Yes.
a chilled style of music, just how this song is not really for dancing, unlike previous Beatles songs were.
Romantic. It's all romantic.
Yeah.
And in the lyrics, it plays on the romantic sentiment of the song. We wouldn't call it, I mean, you could, but you wouldn't call it like the poetry that they go on to write later in their career.
Yeah.
It's
simple.
It's simple, and it's quite earnest, and it's quite sentimental, as Paul often is. It's just a really nice love song, I suppose.
But it's a bit Moon and June, isn't it? Was it bright are the stars in the sky, dark as the night, or something like that?
Bright are the stars that shine, dark as the sky.
There you go. I mean, it's just like, you're thinking poetry.
Yeah.
Night, day,
101,
but that's fine because that's it's quite innocent. I mean, again, this is pre-psychedelic Beatles, pre everything that happened Beatles, pre-arguments Beatles. This is early Beatles. They're young men, So you've got a young man who's starry-eyed, really. He's met this incredible woman who he's clearly completely in love with. And, I think when you're completely in love, you don't tend to bring in elements of doubt or sarcasm or anything. It's on the nose. So that's what he's doing.
And the song was released on the Hard Day's Night album that sent them into the stratosphere, to be honest. And same day, the film hits the theatres and everyone gets to watch Paul look down the camera and sing this love song while the rest of the Beatles, as you said, sit about and Ringo plays the bongos.
I think in a time before music videos and that sort of thing, that film gave such a connection to the fans. And like a tender moment like this, they could have worked it into the plot, but instead it's effectively just a live performance in the fiction of the film. But it's a great way to see the Beatles perform this song.
Also, George Harrison, on the set of Hard Day's Night, met Pattie Boyd. She was one of the schoolgirls on the train, and so that was where that romance began. So I think the Beatles and the girlfriends they had is a very, very, very important part of the story. I mean, obviously with Yoko Ono, it's huge, but I think with all of the girlfriends, they helped shape the story of the Beatles because these were these were interesting, intelligent, sophisticated young women who had their own ideas, and you definitely see that with Pattie Boyd, I think, and I think you also see it with Jane Asher.
Of course.
What's also interesting with this song in the film, Hard Day's Night, just as a little sort of interesting point is that the chords that John is playing in the film don't line up with the actual chords. I think whoever was editing the film got the timing of the strums in time, but not the chord changes. So
it's the right song, just wrong timing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think they moved it a bar out of time, so he's changing chord and then there's no chord change, and then it's a little jarring if you notice it.
That.
Yeah.
And this song gets recorded by George Martin and his orchestra to be released on the same single as the Ringo's theme brackets This Boy from the film, the great segment of the film where Ringo's walking down the banks of the river, bunking off from his duties.
Yeah, the bit where he's trying to take a photograph, always cracks me up.
Amazing. And that's very 60s, almost like the Shadows, Ringo's theme, This Boy.
The instrumentals.
The instrumentals, yeah. And this gets recorded in the same way, and it feels very, as we said earlier, very 60s.
Totally 60s, and I think that was a 60s thing to do. For you have the version, and then you have the Beatles Go Bossa Nova album, or Beatles Go Easy Listening album, and there's so many albums like that. I mean, this was an official one, but there's countless unofficial ones. very, very 60s. You know, you have a nice tune, and now we're going to do the kind of easy listening instrumental version.
Yeah.
And there's lots of that. So it's all got an innocence. You know, it's not questioning the status quo in any way. It's not kind of pushing the boundaries of the mind in the way that from, you know, really, I suppose, from Rubber Soul and Revolver onwards they were doing. It's innocent, it's romantic, it's quite, you could say square, but very charming, you know.
And just again shows the popularity of, now I'm thinking about instrumental songs back in the early 60s. We've got Telstar and we've got The Shadows and then...
It's funny, you
to
rarely
that.
get instrumentals nowadays, but there was a boom of them back then. And I think, you know, the Beatles work so well in instrumental form because the melodies are so strong. You know, when I used to make my living playing piano in weddings and hotels and stuff, the Beatles are such good songs to go for because even if you're just playing instrumentally on the piano, everyone recognises what it is. Whereas if you play like an Ed Sheeran song or something, you know, no shade on Ed Sheeran, but the melodies don't have as much character to them. You need the singing to recognise the song, which the Beatles, you know, they didn't need that.
Yeah, so the melody, because often with pop music now, the melody is in the vocals, isn't it? Quite often.
Yeah, but
just
even the choice of chords nowadays can be so you know, repetitive and simple that the melodies are quite repetitive and simple. So without the words and the singing, you may not actually recognise the tune in instrumental form.
Right.
Whereas the Beatles, their tunes are so recognisable even without the words and even without Paul McCartney singing it.
And in the impact of this song, again, we've touched on it, but it's just showing that the Beatles are not just a rock and roll band that are going to be a flash in the pan. They're here to stay, and they're going to try their hand at bossa nova, and they're going to try their hand at this and that, ballads, etc.
I think also it moved a social change because, you know, when I think about what I do as a living, you know, I'm a music critic, and I'm, you know, specialising in rock and pop as a middle-aged man. That would have been unthinkable in the 1960s. You know, if there's a job to be had, you'd be doing classical, maybe jazz, but pop music would be something that the newspapers would hardly cover. You know, you started having people like Leonard Bernstein noticing what the Beatles were doing. It wasn't just Beatlemania, which is obviously a phenomenon, and of course the papers would be writing about it, but by the time you get to songs like this, you see, well, this is really sophisticated, and people were taking it seriously in media, I think probably in the classical music world, you know, whereas before it would have just been rejected.
Well, you had the classic story about the Aeolian cadence, where I think it was a critic for the Times wrote very, you know, a positive review about the Beatles song "Not a Second Time" and used all of this sort of classical jargon to describe it, including the term Aeolian cadence. And when John Lennon was asked about his use of the Aeolian cadence, he said it sounded like a exotic bird.
Absolutely no idea.
Yeah,
of course.
Of course. And to be honest, Aeolian cadence doesn't actually mean anything. It's all sort of pomp and almost seemed like the critic was trying to over fluff.
He's finding words to describe something that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, and you know, but the point is that he did genuinely enjoy the song and thought, I want to bring this to my audience who usually, as you said, read about classical and far more sort of typically art music.
And this song, again, the spread of audience, we're now getting classical musicians listening to the Beatles, we've got the pop fans, now we've got maybe a younger audience, a teenage, well, they were always teenage girls, but now we've got the love song that your mum would like to listen, or their mum would like to listen to if it was on the radio. It's not that crass pop music.
Yeah.
There's a bit of sophistication for the adults in there.
Oh, definitely. But also for you know, I think this has probably really helped in the Heartthrob Stakes as well, because there's a film which came out recently. I think it's called just the Beatles 64, Beatles in America or something. Anyway, it's about that time on the Ed Sullivan Show and all that kind of stuff. And they're interviewing all these girls in the street, and they're all saying, "Oh, it was just, you know," they're talking about how beautiful the music is and how it's all positive and it's good things and all this kind of stuff. And they're imagining themselves with these young men. You know, they're falling in love with them. And I think having a love song like this, you're going to imagine it being written about yourself. You imagine it sing. So it's very appealing. You know, so I think yes, it would be seen as appealing to parents, but I think it'd be very appealing to all the young Beatles fans who are falling desperately in love with Paul McCartney or George or any of them. You know.
Yeah.
And Paul was very proud of this song. He said it was the first song he ever impressed himself with. And John was also impressed with this song, saying it was Paul's first Yesterday, which he goes on to slag off in Give Me Some... No, sorry, not Give Me Some True. He goes on to slag off in How Do You Sleep, saying...
so the only thing you did was yesterday?
Yeah. So he almost having a go at him there, but I think John understands that Yesterday and songs like these are, again, what set the Beatles apart from other bands of that time. And while he might not agree with the gushy sentimentality, he certainly believes that it was another feather to their cap.
Yeah.
And Paul's played it at his famous MTV Unplugged show, and just a cover version that I wanted to bring up is Kurt Cobain.
Surprising.
Haunting version, yeah.
Which Kurt Cobain was such a huge fan of, especially the early Beatles records. He would have, we know it as With the Beatles, it was Meet the Beatles for Kurt. And this version that he does on his home recordings that were released in the documentary Montage of Heck in 2015, I think it was, it's such a sad, haunted, disorientating version of it that just, you don't know whether it's...
The change in mood completely recontextualizes the lyric, and now it feels like the end of a relationship instead of the beginning.
That's a sign of a good song, isn't it? The way it can be interpreted in that way.
Yeah.
Because I take the song from the original version as being so pure, almost like courtly love, you know, courtly, not Courtney. You know, it's very, very pure and very innocent. You know, sort of chivalric. And yeah, when you hear Kurt Cobain's one, because he was such a tortured soul by then in particular, it's totally reinterpreted. I think it does have a haunting quality, the song. But then so does a lot of bossa nova. It's the bittersweet. You know, just pure happiness would be rather trite. I think it's got that shade, but it's not dark. I don't call it a dark song. I think it's a pure light song, really. It's just got a kind of depth that is there for interpretation.
Yeah.
Well, we hope you have enjoyed the show. We're sorry, but it is time to go. Now, make sure to subscribe to UnBeatled on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast to never miss an episode. Thank you to Will and Dave for joining me. Now, the only thing that's left for you to do is sit back, put on the record, relax, and float downstream. We'll see you next time for Strawberry Fields Forever, a song based on John Lennon's childhood memories in Liverpool.